Title: The Clock of Shadows. Alicia never believed in superstitions. Since she was little, her mother had told her stories about the old clock that was in the main room of the mansion of Los Montgomery. But for her, those were only unfounded stories, fantasies created to scare children, until she inherited the house. The mansion had been empty for years, and Alicia D. He decided to move there, seeking a new beginning. However, something in the air was different. From the first day, he felt a strange heaviness in the atmosphere, as if the house itself were watching him. That old clock, covered in dust and with a large iron chain, was in a forgotten corner of the room, but something about its presence didn't leave her calm. The tick-tock Alicia was alone in the mansion, trying to adapt to her new home. The house was enormous, with long hallways and rooms full of old furniture and family heirlooms. There was something unsettling in the corners, something that he couldn't define, but the clock seemed to be the center of everything. Every time he passed near it, he felt that time stretched strangely, as if the hands marked something more. Scalas horas. That night, while reading in the living room, the ticking of the clock began to sound louder. At first he thought it was his imagination, but soon the sound became unmistakable, each time stronger and deeper, as if the clock were alive. He decided to approach the clock, a feeling of discomfort running down his spine. The hands moved at an irregular rhythm, as if something was out of time, something that didn't correspond to normal hours. Suddenly, the clock stopped, and a profound silence filled the house. Alicia felt a shiver run through her body. But the strangest thing happened afterwards. The shadows in the room began to move, sliding along the walls as if they had a life of their own. Without knowing why, Alicia felt that something was watching her. Ando. The history of the clock. That night, unable to sleep, Alicia decided to investigate the mansion's past. In her maternal grandfather's old archives, she found a yellowed letter written or an ancestor of the Montgomery family. The letters spoke of the clock and its strange power. This clock, although it seems harmless, is a dark artifact. Its creator, an old man called Elias Montgomery, built it to trap time, or rather to control souls. Each time the hands stop, the clock releases the shadows that inhabit it, shadows that seek a new body to which to adhere. Those who have touched the clock or have been near it are no longer the same, for the clock feeds on their fears and desires. Alicia's heart quickened upon reading those words. The letter continued explaining that whoever dared to wind the clock would be condemning their soul, and the clock, no matter how many times it was stopped, would continue functioning as a portal Asia the unknown, the game of shadows. Despite the warnings, Alicia couldn't help but feel curious. Every night, the clock seemed to call her. Its ticking resonated in her ears. Like a I surmised that it pushed her closer. At first, she only observed silently, but then, one night, she decided to wind it. When she did, the clock emitted a deep sound, almost like a heartbeat. The shadows in the room began to move more quickly, colliding with each other as if they were living creatures. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the air, it became dense, heavy. Alicia felt a presence beside her, something that observed her incessantly. It was then that the shadows began to take human form, approaching her with an intensity that had paralyzed her. The dark figures whispered her name, but Alice could not move. The clock kept ticking, each tick bringing more and more shadows towards her. The air became unbreathable, like if I were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The last tick-tock, Alicia desperately tried to leave the room, but the shadows surrounded her. Every time she tried to move, time seemed to stop, and the dark figures held her tightly. She felt her strength disappearing, how something inside her began to fade, as if the clock were stealing something essential from her. In his desperation, he remembered the letter. The only way to stop the clock and the shadows was to destroy it, but the clock was so old that it seemed impossible to break. However, with the last bit full of energy, Alicia ran towards the clock, and with a desperate force, she tried to break the chain that held it. At first, nothing happened. But then, with a final effort, The chain gave way, and the clock collapsed to the floor. The ticking sound stopped completely, and the shadows began to dissipate slowly. The room, previously full of darkness, returned to calm. But when she turned, and she was no longer in the mansion. She was in an empty place, suspended in time, surrounded by darkness. And in her hands the clock shone again, as if it had never stopped working. End.